My name is Faisal Devji. I am Professor of Indian History in Oxford, and I'm interviewing Glyn Ford for Voices for Oxford. Glyn Ford, who is the author of this rather handsome volume, is Director of Track to Asia and a member of the Labour Party's International Commission. He was for a number of years, for 25 years I think, a member of the European Parliament. Welcome.
Thank you.
So Glyn, I wonder if we can begin by talking about the forthcoming Vietnam round of talks.
I mean, you had the first round of talks in Singapore back in June last year. Part of the problem was you actually have two leaders who actually want to find a solution on top of two bureaucracies who are very less certain about whether there is a solution to be found. And certainly in Washington, it's very clear that if you want, John Bolton is rather hostile to the process, to put it mildly, and I think Mike Pompeo is rather sceptical. And you have the same problems in Pyongyang. So in a sense, this is probably make or break, because you had good chemistry last time, but effectively no process. This time round, you're going to have good chemistry again. You're certainly going to get Donald Trump coming out saying he's made important progress. The test is going to be what happens after that. You need some real action to take place on both sides. I mean, it's not a what they're supposed to trade off against each other. This is a business relationship, and so you need to sign some real progress. And there's some talk that what they should do is actually set up a series of summits so that they can progress chase. Maybe with a second summit on the anniversary of the Singapore summit, and maybe even a fourth one. It's in September at UNGA around the UN General Assembly. So you've actually got some movement. The problem is it's very staccatic at the moment. You get progress and then it freezes solid till the next summit. You've got to have movement in between. You can't carry on like that.
Speaking of President Trump, how important do you think his role was in these talks? Was he important simply in initiating the movement, or does the United States have to intervene repeatedly?
Well, I mean, you don't have a solution without the United States. I mean, it's the United States that were threatening fire and fury, President Trump, who was threatening Little Rocket Man and the rest. I mean, there is no solution to the Korean Peninsula without United States participation. I mean, certainly with the current administration in South Korea, Moon Jae-in, a progressive administration, he's very keen to have a reconciliation between North and South. So they're not the problem. The problem is in Washington, and the problem is about the demand that North Korea denuclearize, because that is not a demand put on India, Pakistan or Israel for that matter.
Exactly. I mean, do you think that it's possible to imagine an arrangement between the two Koreas which does not include denuclearization?
Well, between the two Koreas, yes, but I mean the problem is it's a slight irrelevance, because there is no solution without the United States. I mean, when the United States back in November 2017 was actually threatening military action against Kim after he launched the ICBM that was capable of hitting all of the mainland United States, apart possibly from Florida, it was not the South Koreans that were going to be launching those preemptive strikes, or the bloody nose, or making a submarine disappear. This was going to be the US military. So, I mean, yes, you can have an arrangement between North and South, but frankly, that will never be allowed by Washington. You've got to have Washington signing off on this.
Do you think the recent history of American foreign policy, including in Libya, in Iraq, and in Iran, actually encourages strongmen to give up nuclear weapons?
No, absolutely the reverse. I mean, I was in North Korea in 2003 time, when, if you want, Colonel Gaddafi came in from the cold, and the North Koreans were being told in front of me, why didn't you follow Colonel Gaddafi's example? I mean, he's given up his nuclear ambitions. One can argue about how serious they were, but he did give up some nuclear weapons components, some precursors, and you could be welcomed into the world. Well, a month before Kim Jong-un, if you want, took power, he was able to graphically watch the brutal murder of Colonel Gaddafi on TV. The lesson they've learned is the problem is not having weapons of mass destruction, it's not having weapons of mass destruction. So it's not encouraging them to give up, it's encouraging them to keep them. And the only trade-off you're going to get is for Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons in exchange for very, very solid security guarantees that are more than a piece of paper and require real action on the ground, and possibly guaranteed by certainly a group of countries that may look very similar to the UN Security Council.
So in some ways then one might even argue that the problem is not the relationship between North and South Korea so much as between North Korea and its neighbors more broadly, if it feels the need to protect itself from superpower intervention.
Yeah, well, certainly it's a long time since there's been any, in my view, since there's been any real threat from the South Koreans to invade the North. I mean, the 1950 Civil War, I think that the North invaded the South, but there have been a whole series of clashes prior to that, and certainly both sides have been threatening each other. Both North and South they want the unified Korea. That's not the case anymore. So any threat to Korea, any real military threat to Korea, comes from, frankly, the United States. Possibly China, but it's really the United States that's a big issue. I mean, Japan is very hostile, but they will do nothing without Washington, and nor will South Korea. They may be pulled into it. So it's a North Korea-US issue that's got to be resolved.
So what then is the role of China and the six-party talks in this?
There is no role for the six-party talks. Six-party talks are dead. Now, the six-party talks are about stopping North Korea going nuclear, and then North Koreans say to me, we are nuclear. So, and secondly, you have a real problem with Japan, because Japan is seen not only by North Korea but also by South Korea as spoilers in this game, because of the issue around the abductees. You can decide how important you want, and for various historical reasons. So, in my view, the best you're going to get is five-party talks. The big issue is going to be whether, if you want, Moscow is going to be in the mix or not. I don't see Tokyo being in there unless attitudes change rather dramatically. Because part of the problem is that the Tokyo says, Abe says, we can't have talks to return all the missing abductees. Well, they've been around that loop several times. The North Koreans say there are no more abductees remaining. But according to the Japanese, they're all alive and will have to be returned, despite the fact that one of them is in his mid-90s. In a country, North Korea, with a life expectancy for men of 67.
Do you think reunification is on the cards at all?
Oh, absolutely not. It's one system, two countries. I mean, North Korea is now a market economy. I mean, it's a peculiar kind of market economy. It's the market economy for one-party states. It's the chaebol like they used to have in South Korea. There's Zaibatsu in Japan, state-owned enterprises, as a la Beijing and Hanoi. It's no accident that the talks are in Hanoi. So it's a market economy, and so's the South. So they're both market economies, so one system, but very much two countries. The North says early reunification can only be assimilation. I mean, with an economy that's 40 times smaller, that's assimilation. What they leave us alone is their view. Leave us alone. We're as bright and intelligent as South Koreans, Singaporeans, Hong Kong, whatever. If you leave us alone, we can grow our economy at 10, 15% a year for 25 years. Then we can talk unification. But until then, forget it.
That's interesting. So, I mean, because when one looks at reunification around the world, there are very few instances of it. I mean, there's Germany, that's the prime example that comes up. In every other case, we see
But that
division.
was a disaster for the East Germans.
Exactly.
I mean, regime survival is the name of the game.
Yes.
I mean, the reunification would be extremely painful, because the differential between North and South Korea is probably close to 10 times what it was between East and West Germany. And we saw the political and social and economic problems generated in Germany. I mean, what the North Koreans are much more interested in is the Irish peace process, because there you had peace without unification. Yes. So they're not really studying German unification. They're more interested in Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, the Irish peace process, those kind of areas, rather than, if you want, let's follow Germany. Germany is a complete no-no for them.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, it also puts one in mind of a very different set of relations, but China and Taiwan, where you have non-recognition, but you have full integration economically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they are models of that.
I mean, there's a real problem. If you have a successful peace process between North and South, there's a real problem that no one's addressing yet, and that's possibly because you don't need to address it yet. But you will have this enormous, steep economic sort of slope. In North Korea, people earn a good wage is 30. People bribe people to get jobs for $30 a month. Now, once you get a porous border, you're going to get tens of thousands, if not more, economic migrants crossing from north to south. Because even the worst job in South Korea is going to be paid 100 times more than you're getting in the north. And that issue is just absolutely not being addressed.
So that, of course, raises the question of whether the two Koreas are now fundamentally distinct societies, despite the calls for family reunification and visits and all the rest.
I mean, I think at the moment they are very distinct societies. I mean, they're one people, but they're very much two societies at the moment. I mean, and two economies. I think you can bring them together. I believe that you can have a peaceful process, but it will take time. And it's not going to be 12 months. It's going to be 25 years, which is why I think in Washington there's a misunderstanding. I mean, Kim Jong-un is looking for a process that's going to take a decade, whereas Americans talk about it all be over by Christmas. Well, that is not going to happen. I mean, you can have real progress. You can have staging points on the way, but the last nuclear weapon, if it ever comes out of North Korea, will be coming out in over 10 years' time, 15 years' time, not now. Partly because you need trust building, because they don't trust each other, and they're both right. They both let down the other side. It's not a one-way street, so they both let each other down, and they're also going to be looking for some compensation. I mean, the North Koreans are giving up something that costs billions. They want something for that. And it's likely to be infrastructure, and that infrastructure is going to have to be built. They want to see it on the ground. My own view is it's going to be energy related, because the big choke point in the North Korean economy is energy shortages. So if you want any, they're much more, in my view, they're much more interested in energy than a railway line. Some new railway line across North Korea from South Korea is going to be carrying South Korean goods to Europe. A gas pipeline will be providing energy to North Korea and South Korea. So, I mean, it's energy infrastructure I think they'll be demanding, and that's going to have to be delivered before it's over.
Is China the unseen hand or the unseen player in these talks?
Well, I mean, after Kim Jong-un came to power back in 2010, there was an extremely toxic relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang. The arrest of Jan Son-taek, the uncle, and his execution was all about that. He was close to China. He was also very close to Kim Jong-nam, who is the elder half-brother who was murdered in Malaysia. And that was all seen as Chinese. I mean, originally when the North Koreans were interested in, if you want, doing Kissinger, they'd like to have switched relations from Beijing to Washington. But as soon as Kim Jong-un actually travelled to Beijing a year ago, it was very clear that the Americans, if they understood what was on offer, had rejected it. They probably didn't understand what was on offer. So it was back to, if you want, a different relationship with China. People used to talk about lips and teeth. The North Koreans now talk about a pragmatic relationship with Beijing, and Beijing's now in the mix like it wasn't for a long time. Kim Jong-un had not met Xi on a single occasion in 8 years, and now he's met him 4 times in less than 12 months.
So pragmatism seems to be the name of the game, and one might imagine that rather than the fantasy of reunification, what is being called for is a well-done partition of the kind that we see with the former partition of Czechoslovakia, for instance, where you have borders, but you have relations.
I mean, if you talk to ordinary North Koreans, they're very keen on unification. Of all ages, If you talk to South Koreans, you're very keen on unification if you're over 65, possibly 75. Young people are completely not interested. I mean, the costs of unification are going to be enormous. I was told at some conference not long ago it would only lower living standards in South Korea by around 20-25% if we unified. And I said, yeah, I think Greece living standards went down by 18% and you had riots on the streets. And that's without suddenly finding 10 million. There are 10 million North Koreans within 7 days walk of Seoul. So if the borders go, if you think Syria was a serious refugee crisis, try North Korea, which is one of the reasons that Kim Dae-jung absolutely invented the Sunshine Policy. It was to prop North Korea up. He was absolutely petrified it was going to collapse because it would have been economic, social and political disaster for the South at the time. So if you could get North Korea growing, in 2016 it grew by 5% despite the sanctions. I mean, it's perfectly possible to kickstart that economy, but it's 2 generations down the line before there's any serious discussion. And in the meantime, you've got to make sure that the regime survives. When we had the Irish peace process, people in the United Kingdom were wandering, I presume in Ireland as well, were wandering around with pieces of paper saying, despite the fact we believe you're a terrorist who murdered men, women and children, we will not prosecute you. There is no peaceful unification without if you want the same kind of peace process. Kim Jong-un is not going to jail.
Is internationalization a panacea at all, or is this?
There's 2 different drivers on internationalization, one from the side of North Korea and one from the side of Washington. From the side of North Korea, they don't trust the Americans, so they actually want security guarantees that are guaranteed. They're actually quite interested in the Iran deal, the JCPOA. They're obviously very disappointed that Donald Trump tore up the deal. But nevertheless, it had a resilience and a robustness that, unlike the agreed framework, which is the agreement that the US had with North Korea back in the 1990s, which was torn up by George Bush. I mean, that was dead. I mean, it was torn up by George Bush. Whereas the JCPOA, the Iran deal's got some life afterwards. Yes. So they're interested in internationalizing it by getting a group of guarantors. As I said, like with the JCPOA, that may be the UN Security Council plus. Whereas on the American side, it's a different driver, because the Americans realize that they're going to have to pay compensation, and the Americans aren't going to pay it. There's no way that Donald Trump wants or will be able, Congress would never let him, pay billions of dollars to North Korea. So he's looking for a group of donors. Now, the obvious donors around are going to be South Korea, who certainly will be prepared to put in something like 2/3 of $15 billion. But the problem is the 5. Now, you can have some extension of a branch line of the Belt and Road Initiative, something with Putin's Eastern strategy with the gas pipeline. European Union, last time round, put in money. We were the 3rd largest donor. So you can package that together. So both sides want to internationalize at the appropriate time. And interestingly, in Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech, for the first time, he talked about international peace negotiations that would have a group of people that will consult with those that signed the armistice in 1953. So it's wider than just China, North Korea, US.
That's fascinating because, of course, but a very different story from the kinds of internationalizations you have seen elsewhere, which have been for, as it were, states which are not quite states, like Kosovo or Bosnia or South Sudan or East Timor. This is a very different beast.
Yeah, and what you've got to be careful of here is, I mean, one of the things that North Koreans constantly throw back at the Americans is America keeps trying to have almost agreement creep. The North Koreans have agreed to negotiate a way to military denuclearization, not civil. So they've agreed to denuclearize and get rid of their ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of hitting the mainland United States. Now you start getting demands from people like Pompeo and Bolton, which is, we want you to get rid of your military and civil nuclear power, your long-range missiles, your intermediate-range missiles, chemical weapons, biological weapons, if you want human rights and the abductees. And the response of the North Koreans is, hang on, we are not a surrendered state. We are not Japan in August 1945. We are a state that's agreed to negotiate a way, one specific issue and one platform for delivery. That's it. So, yes.
So you would think in a way this story plays very well in the narrative today of sovereignty, whether it's the US or Britain indeed with Brexit, that you would think people would recognize the need and importance of sovereignty in any negotiation. So this is not a kind of globalized...
No, I agree. And the other problem is, there's a lot of criticism of North Korea for the fact that they haven't denuclearized. But they never promised it. They said, we'll have a negotiation. We will freeze our nuclear weapons testing and our ICBM testing, is what they said. And that they've done. Since November the 29th, 17, there have been no nuclear tests, no intermediate, no missile tests whatsoever. But they only promised to deal with the ICBMs, the long-range ones. So they've kept that. They're still producing nuclear weapons. Why not? The Americans are still producing new Star Wars technologies. I mean, neither side is, the troops are still there. So yes, they're still producing nuclear weapons, they're still producing ICBMs because we don't yet have the agreement. And at the point where you have the agreement, then fine. But no, there's no 2-for-1 offers. You get what's on the box and that's it.
You know, what I find really interesting here is that, going back to your earlier statements on Iran, that what we generally take to be a failed agreement might actually be the precedent for a new way of considering, if not denuclearization, then an agreement with a former foe, presuming its sovereignty.
Yeah. With Iran, it was slightly easier because with Iran, you just let the Iranians have their own money back.
Yes.
The problem you've got with North Korea is you want the same kind of guarantee, you want the same network of guarantors, but alongside that, you need a network of donors. But nevertheless, it's the guarantee. It's very, I mean, the North Koreans say, no way, a piece of paper signed by Donald Trump is not a security guarantee. That's a piece of paper signed by Donald Trump. We need probably, and it's a process, as I said, over a decade, maybe more. During that process, I certainly expect the number of US troops to be scaled down in South Korea, certainly expecting, if you want, the guarantee to become a broader one, linking in certainly some of the regional powers, and as I said, I believe probably the UN Security Council.
And finally, is there a possibility here, as often happens in the Middle East after each war, of private companies and corporations, or indeed sovereign funds of other states, making, as it were, a peace contribution for their own profits?
Oh, absolutely, and Donald Trump's been pushing very hard. I mean, I have to say, as you said earlier, I'm an active member of the British Labour Party, and the North Koreans subscribe to the Daily Mail. They obviously think it's a good paper, not something I necessarily share. But in reading out the headlines, and I was asked by Ri So-young, who's one of the 4 people in the room with Trump at the summit in Singapore, why don't you like Donald Trump? My response was, as an active member of the Labour Party, I can't think of a single thing that Donald Trump has done that I agree with apart from North Korea.
But that's
and I'm still struggling. I'm still struggling for a second one, but fine. So, yeah, I mean...
That might prove indeed to be his great legacy in foreign policy.
Well, I mean, it could be. I mean, he's right. This problem has not been solved. I mean, it's obviously an issue back in 53 when the Civil War, the proxy war of civilizations was taking place, and then you got the armistice, and essentially almost nothing happened with the Americans apart from having troops there through till the late 80s, early 90s, and Clinton was probably the first one who got seriously involved. The Clinton, Bush, Obamas really were not able to solve it. They tried various ways, and they didn't get an answer. Trump, maybe he's approaching it in a very different way, but the problem is he's got to get what the North Koreans call his adjutants to deliver, because that's what the sticking point is. I mean, the North Koreans are very convinced that Trump agreed to an end of war declaration in Singapore. when Pompeo went over last July to visit Kim Jong-un, I mean, he was accused of being a gangster because you've come here demanding verification, inventory, inspections. Where's the end of war declaration we were promised?
It's almost like these adjutants, as they put it, represent the old world that Trump is seeking to break through.
Well,
they keep walking back.
The North Koreans, you know, I mean, certainly people at the top, they know everything. I mean, they can discuss the French local election results if you want. They don't necessarily fully understand them, but they've read fear. And they've read I'm part of the resistance inside the White House, the New York Times op-ed that was some insider saying there we are trying to frustrate Trump. Yes. Now, we may be keen to frustrate Trump building his wall, less keen to frustrate Trump in his attempt to get peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That really is a fascinating story. I recommend all viewers to read this book, Talking to North Korea, Ending the Nuclear Standoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.